Welcome back to Couve. My name is David Benedictus.
And I'm Daria Ruggles. Welcome back.
And today we're continuing our series on local heroes and what they're doing for you here locally. Today we have Representative Sharon-Wylie from the 49th District, and we're going to have a conversation about what she's been up to in the legislature and how she got to the legislature.
Welcome, Sharon. We're so honored and happy to have you here. So we would love to know, first of all, how did you get started? How did you go from concerned citizen to elected official?
Well, I kind of came of political age back in the 70s. I'm going to be 72 on my next birthday, and the first time I ever got paid to work in a campaign was for a state Senate race in California when I was still a student. And it was the year that Jerry Brown ran for governor the first time.
Okay.
So that was, and I ended up just getting addicted to politics. And I was kind of I had a dual major in studio art and pre-law legal philosophy. I was going to go to law school. And it turned out the foreign language requirement, I had no aptitude for foreign languages. And my advisor told me that I'd struggled through 2 quarters of Italian and discovered that Italian wasn't good enough. And I was going to have to start over. And they said, why don't you look at all the legal and political stuff you're taking? Why don't you switch to poli-sci? And so I switched to poli-sci to avoid the language requirement. And I've been a political junkie ever since. And so I've gone back and forth between sort of issue campaigning and mostly as a consultant and a campaign manager type, running campaigns. And periodically people would ask me, why don't you run? And I'm a former stutterer in high school. It was panic stuttering. It wasn't developmental stuttering. There's kind of a difference. It was sort of trauma stuttering. And I thought, I'm never going to do that. I couldn't do the public speaking. And in my senior year of high school, I was the summer project of our speech coach. He nailed me in a class and recruited me and got me through it. So I had a bad piano teacher that caused the trauma, and a great public school teacher who rescued me from myself. And so I still choke, I still forget things, but I know I'm not going to die, and so it kind of works out. So I've been political for years, and I got involved in the feminist movement, started a rape crisis center. After I lived in Detroit for a while, and and then went back to school after taking a break, and moved to Seattle, was the first co-director of King County Rape Relief, which is now the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center. And so when I was hired, there were 1.5 seated positions, 1 desk, 2 phones, and 2 part-time jobs for 4 months in a multi-service center. And when I left, we had 65 volunteers, 4 staff people, and now they have 400 volunteers.
Wow.
And their annual breakfast is something no politician in the Puget Sound area ever misses. And the person, when I left, I went on the board of directors when I left the staff position. And the director that we hired when I was on that board is still there, Mary Ellen Stone, who's a wonderful, wonderful human being and has done a fabulous job.
Wow.
You were also involved in some work here in Clark County before you were elected. What did you do here in Clark County?
Well, I think when I first came over here, I did some public relations work for what was then the Hazel Dell Sewer District. And then went back to consulting because I'd left I had been in the Oregon legislature, and I left. I didn't run again so that we could move back to Washington State. And so I was doing consulting work in human resources, and the housing authority was sort of a home for the Council for the Homeless, and they had a problem. They'd committed themselves to the first annual luncheon to honor people that work to help people that are homeless, a Hunger and Homeless Awareness Week, and their gala auction, all were happening in the same time, and they had committed to it. And then the person who was coordinating had quit. And so they said, Council for the Homeless needs help. Would you postpone your HR project and go work for them? I see you've done community organizing. And I said, sure. I also had a restaurant along the way, so I was pretty good at organizing food events. And so I ended up being a part-time person to put those things together. And I interviewed all the honorees and got the editorials in the paper and did the event. And oh, by the way, for the gala, they told me we're not going to have any alcohol for obvious reasons, and you have to figure out how to raise money. And oh, and we're going to use teenagers to put it together. And so I had to go find the teenagers and compete with the Humane Society for their public service programs. So that was an interesting time. But I ended up getting involved with the Council for the Homeless, and I stayed on their board for about 15 years. And so that was that. My husband and I both, housing issues and homeless issues are something that are really near and dear to our heart, and we've that's sort of our person, that and the environment are sort of our personal focus for helping the world, helping the community. So we both care a lot about the environment and the outdoors and energy and that sort of thing, but also housing, and I, we've been around long enough to have watched the deterioration of federal funding for low-income housing, and the sad results of dismantling the state hospitals, which were terrible places, and not replacing them with community-based services. And so those two things over the last 50 years, and a lot of other things have, and the anti-government trends going back to Reagan years, I think, have combined to create a crisis in housing and a crisis in mental health and addiction services. And so we're reaping that now, but I think we're finally understanding how badly that reality serves everybody. And I think that a lot of what we're doing at the state level and the local level is moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet, clearly.
We were talking, David and I were just talking about this because David has a mental health background. This shift that needs to take place between the criminality of these things and the public health issue, and that shift that needs to take place. Do you see that as one of the things that's beginning?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the reasons that when I go to national conferences is I'm hoping to learn about best practices. And what I always find out is Washington State has the only best practices there are. And as imperfect as it is, there's very little, there's not that much to learn massively from other states. And we've done a couple things. We've, as difficult as it was, we've combined physical and mental health services in a big way. And we've moved that direction in what we require of our insurance companies and what we're doing with our public health system and our addiction services and our mental health systems all together. And we've done that. And Clark County was a bellwether. We were one of the first enactors of that legislative policy. And then our governor 2 years ago took huge steps to actually provide those community-based services, to update and make state-of-the-art the state confinement services for the severely mentally ill or criminally insane folks, but also to provide those community-based services for serious mental illness, so that people can get well, and they can get well close to the people who love them.
Which is the best practice, yes.
Exactly. And so we're moving in that direction, but it takes time to get those systems set up and to build them. And so we're investing capital dollars to build those systems, to help, and then money to create the capacity with the nonprofit community, and to create a system, just like you want clean water and clean restaurants to be the same everywhere you go in a state. You also want people to have access to the best services, or the best education, no matter where their zip code is.
It's a public health infrastructure.
Exactly.
Infrastructure is the word of the day, right? So that's something that we could have built back in the 60s and 70s when we were appropriately institutionalizing. I was working in the California mental health system when Reagan did the right thing, but then the community health system was not robustly energized to receive.
No, they didn't take the leftover money and put it where it needed to be. And when I was in the Oregon legislature, my sister was a brand new MSW and was working with chronically mentally ill people, and they were closing Dammish State Hospital. And one of her first clients decompressed, a mom who did really well most of the time, and there was no damage to get her stabilized, and she killed herself. And I remember that family dinner when she was so devastated. And one of the things that I did as a freshman in Oregon, which I'm very proud, this is something I'm still proud of, I banded together with another freshman Republican, and they were trying to take the money from selling Dammish State Hospital, which was prime mini mansion land at that time, and they were going to absorb the money, and it was going to go God knows where. And we threw it back into committee to make sure that the money would go into mental health. And I don't know whether long-term that's what it did, but I remember pushing it back, instead of voting on it, we threw it back into committee, and with people, mental health advocates in the balcony cheering us on. Because they weren't going to spend the money on mental health when they sold all that beautiful land.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. So Sharon, when we're talking about this mental health thing, and then we're also, so much in the news has been this police brutality and systemic racism. And what do you think, and what are we working on so that we can do, for example, you were talking about looking at other states, and I think it's Colorado that does this. They send mental health professionals in place of police officers for many of these calls, and they've had tremendous success and 0 arrests. So in terms,
and they've done that in Eugene for years, and that's part of what I don't know that we have the funding, the resources, and the know-how to make every community able to do that, but that is the trend, and that is where this state is going, is to make sure that there are mental health professionals where a situation could go very badly if it's a strict law enforcement response. And we're going to be upping the amount of de-escalation training, which it is there, but obviously it's not working well. And so there are so many. You've probably looked at some of the myriad of bills that all fit together. And our state, we have leaders within our legislative body who are my heroes, who have been working with police, with families of people who have been shot by police, and with the legal community for 5-10 years to get at this. And a lot of the bills that we passed this year that are very trendy in terms of what the news covers have been 10 years in the making.
Wow.
And a lot of the stuff we got beat up for when we tried to pass the police bill a few years ago, and the press got all mad at us because the initiative and all of that was was out of order, and we tried to do it legislatively, and it was too tricky, and the newspaper said it wasn't transparent and everything. But we were just trying to fix it so that we could be closer to where we are now. And we're still, it's going to be a process. And we have more members of color than probably in any other legislative body in the country. We've had, it goes back and forth between being equal or a majority of women in our Democratic caucus. The Republican caucus looks different than that. But the communities of color that have sent their members proudly to the legislature, they expect those members to lead, and so do we. You know, sometimes a lot of people try to grab onto the same issue. You know, it's important, and you want to be first, and you want to be first on the list. We did not do that this time. We made sure that our leaders were the people that were living the experiences and had the backing of their communities and had been involved in the work that's been leading up to this moment. And I'm very, very proud of the collective work that we've done. It's been good, and it's going to be better.
Oh, that's so heartening to hear. And I want to know, definitely want to know like what you're most proud of that you just got out of session with. But while you're thinking about that, the question I have now is, you know, listening to you, I realized like the wonkiness or recognizing the political science thing, even if it came about because you felt linguistically challenged. When people are watching this and they're feeling like, I'm not as smart as her. I don't have that natural ability. What do you have to say to people that maybe feel discouraged and really don't know how to engage or be effective? What would you say to folks like that?
Well, I would, you know, I've lived a long time, and what you will find, and I reflect on the past a lot. And there have been people that barely touched my life that have been incredibly impactful. And years ago, when I was with the Rape Crisis Center, I had 3 runaways named Tammy who'd been abused, either abused by pimps on the street or by their family. And it's really hard. Once kids get into the system, it's really hard to keep track of them. And I was their advocate, and I held their hand through getting the police reports done and getting a temporary home and all of that. And then they moved on. And I always wondered what had happened to them. And about several years later, I got a phone call in the middle of the night, and it was one of the Tammys. And she said, I know you cared about me. I knew that. We didn't have a lot of time together. I just wanted you to know that I've got a boyfriend who doesn't beat me. I've been emancipated, and I've got a part-time job, and I'm in community college, and I'm doing really great. And I just wanted you to know that.
Oh.
And I just burst into tears.
Yeah.
So I think that that's what people need to know, that tiny things make a huge impact on other humans. And you need to trust that. You need to trust that moment and hang on to that moment and look for more moments. And then if it's politics, the newspaper, the media focuses on the negative. It's not left or right. It's negative, because it's just like, it's the same thing that people slow down for a car wreck. You know, it is what it is, and it grabs our attention. And so what gets covered is more negative than what the reality is. So it's not as ugly as it looks from the outside. But I will say the federal piece is probably uglier than the state piece. But I've come to simplify what it is. And one of the things that I believe is so true, and I probably say it so much that people close to me get tired of hearing it, but the only difference between the Republicans and the Democrats are how they answer 2 questions. There's only, and 2 questions. And if you frame it that way, there's nothing you can't talk about, or no way that, and there is some common ground. The common ground might not be common ground you want to seek, but there will be common ground. And the answers to those, how they answer to those 2 questions is everything. And one question is, how does the economy work? And what is the proper role of government? that informs, what do you think is good tax policy? What helps businesses? What creates jobs? What do kids need to learn in school? And then on the other side of what is the proper role of government is, how much should government interfere with your freedom? You know, what is freedom? What is a hand up and what is a hand out? What kind of help weakens somebody versus lifts somebody up and launches them and lets them spread their wings? And that's why you will find a, you know, individual responsibility. Don't enable somebody who's lazy, blah, 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 who will say, hungry children can't learn, so we should have breakfast after the bell and school lunch programs that are really robust and don't shame kids with poor families.
Mhm, mhm.
And then you come together.
Yes, I was watching, in preparation, I was watching the Florida responses to amendments on 5044, the school equity issue, training issues, and that bill coming across, and I went looking for that after I saw your Facebook post of April 11th, and I was thinking about exactly how the tribalism intention in the federal level was impacting the dialogue, the civil dialogue in Washington, because you see it all in the paper, but I wanted to see how people actually talk with each other in the body itself.
And that was the worst. I mean, that was probably one of the most offensive debates that I've experienced.
I was really impressed with your Facebook post and the time you took to write that.
It had to percolate a few days because I had to process that whole thing and figure out what is it I'm going to say about that, but I have to say something.
What I was thinking about, as you talked about local versus state or federal, I was thinking about Jim Walsh's comment that brought out exactly what you said. And he said, well, I just think it's a policy difference, and that the difference in the way I look at how we do policy, rather, and that it should be a local issue. Local school boards and local schools should make those decisions about what kind of training they want to bring in. And so when does it rise to the level of the state needing to step in? And
well, you know, but the fundamental principle for Democrats is that when it comes to civil rights, and there used to be Republicans that believed this too. That's why there were Republican, you know, Lincoln was a Republican, and why the Civil Rights Bill originally passed with bipartisan support. But you don't leave civil rights issues to the local level, because that's why towns have lynching.
mm-hmm.
You know, you don't do that. That is not okay. That is not okay. And that's what we were talking about, really.
Mm-hmm.
So Sharon, when you say this, I think about things like, you know, the fairness doctrine, that we've lost that, and that so a moment ago when you were talking about how whether Republicans or Democrats answer these two questions, but there's also this concept of like wicked problems, and this idea that there's a basis of civil discourse, but also epistemology, that we all agree on a certain reality that has to do with this. And I wonder how much you think this obfuscation, this and the messaging has interfered with these shared values, so that we have these wicked problems and people are polarized by the way that things are framed, instead of understanding that everyone deserves respect.
I think you have to link up what's going on in the present with technology,
Mm-hmm.
and with Toffler, is it Toffler who wrote Future Shock way back in the day?
Yes. Yeah.
There's when telephones were first invented, rural areas had party lines.
Mm-hmm.
And because people they listened in on each other. They had to establish privacy boundaries about those conversations, and the technology had to keep up with that. we're in a moment like that where our brains and our culture doesn't know what to do about truth. We don't have experts anymore because there's so much information. Everybody feels like an expert, and there's no boundaries. And people, when it comes to saying things that are hurtful, if you're online, you don't see the pain or the tears in someone's eyes when you say something cruel and dismissive. And you don't know them well enough to know how hurtful it was and how much you cut to the bone. And so it's a desensitizing thing, and our brains haven't caught up with that. And then you have this sort of international maliciousness and greed that is manipulating the technology to take advantage of people. And we do not have the tools. Just like we talk about, oh, all we need to do is teach critical thinking in elementary school. I think it's a bigger issue than that, but I don't think it's unsolvable, but it's not an overnight process. And so finding out who are the real experts, how do you determine what is true? And how do you rely on that? How do you pull it out? And how do you, and the psychologists are studying why people will never change their mind who believe in Trump. I have people in my extended family who know that character matters, but when somebody does the kinds of things that Trump did, and they know that's bad character, but they believe that the other people are just as bad. And if anything makes me mad, it's that people think that we're all alike. Not only are we not all alike, there isn't, even among the people I most disagree with, there's not the level of corruption that we're accused of.
Right.
So it's different. It's not, it's not as bad. It's not what you think. It's not as extreme, but there are true differences, and there are people that tell lies.
Well, yeah,
And then there are people that repeat lies without knowing their lies.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, we have things about us that are very similar, but what sets us apart is behavior, right? It's like you may feel that way, but if that person is acting in a way that you objectively recognize as a bad actor, a bad behavior, I have to believe, I heard somewhere that there were recordings that that recorded him speaking with the kind of contempt, because he's a shyster, and I can't believe that there's nothing that
And shyster is a word, one of those words you got to be careful of.
Why?
Shyster used to be a pejorative term about Jewish finance people.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
He's a confidence man, a con man.
Yes.
I'm going to remove the other one out of my, I'm going to definitely remove the other one out of my vocabulary. Thank you for that. But it seems to me, I can't believe that these people are not simply truly deeply. I understand that they've coupled together some emotional aspect, which has conflated over their critical thinking skills, but no one wants to be a sucker. And a confidence man is making you a sucker, but that's the whole thing, that you have this confidence in them.
And you can't admit that you're wrong, but there's also I think, I don't spend a lot of time. I read a little bit of everything. I'm sort of a mile wide and an inch deep in some respects, but a lot of the research there are differences in how the brain works. Just like they've been able to identify the part of the brain that's optimistic versus pessimistic. And you can actually reprogram your brain to a certain degree to not be as pessimistic in general. And there's a lot of work that's interesting work that's being done. And I know people I wish I could send to that school, but but there is a natural tendency towards optimism or pessimism. And there are natural tendencies towards wanting, and people gravitate towards one religion versus another, or one style of parenting versus another, because they're biologically predisposed to need a certain level of uncertainty and lack of squishiness in their worldview.
That's
and
the
I
research
think that
I've seen, yeah.
Mhm.
The uncertainty thing is what drives a lot of that desire for certainty, a deferment to authority figures. And
Exactly, exactly. And there's political and there's party differences that can be identified. But if you assume, I think that, one of my philosophical underpinnings is the bubble of friendly assumptions.
Hmm.
And I believe that it's better to operate out of a bubble of friendly assumptions rather than expecting the worst,
I like
because
that.
you can always recover from a mistake in assuming goodwill or assuming good motives.
mhm,
But if you don't operate from that if you operate from that, sometimes people will rise to the occasion and be better because of that assumption and that expectation. But also it's healthier because you can anticipate things without worrying about jinxing them. You can enjoy them, enjoy and anticipate in a positive way and just get over the disappointment if it doesn't work out. Or you can be negative and prepare for the worst all the time and live in a bubble of misery.
mhm.
And I made a decision a long, long time ago when I was still a child to not live in the bubble of misery. So I live in the bubble of friendly assumptions.
I love that. Talk about, a reinforcing policy. That is lovely. A bubble
It's
of,
how much of your time do you want to spend being miserable?
right,
Exactly. Yeah.
right.
I want to minimize it,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's interesting that you were talking about that because David and I share a love of this neuroscience, and we actually did some programs together at the library, and we have done some things on Robert Sapolsky, and because yeah, so we're with you on that. So now I really do want to know. So you've just come out of session. Please tell us what the good news is, what you're most proud of.
I have been telling people very upfront that I want to see us that when we need new taxes, I want to be sure that they're taxes that move in a less regressive direction. And I've had people that said, I like who you are, but I will never support you because you believe you voted for a sales tax in Oregon and you're going to vote for an income tax in Washington. Well, I'm a realist as well. I believe that the capital gains excise tax is a step in the right direction. I believe that the biggest thing that we did was fund the low income tax credit. And that was got 100%, almost 100% of everybody.
Oh, that's wonderful. So how do those two taxes work?
Well, the low income tax credit is a refund based on how much you probably paid in sales tax. So it's like a sales tax rebate. That's except it's based on sales tax instead of income tax, the way the federal one is.
Okay.
And people have done enough research that they know that having a huge bureaucracy to deny people crumbs to feed their kids, like welfare does, is an expensive way to help people. And when giving people the resources to have a moment to think and plan and get some education and get some childcare and all of that helps people climb out of poverty a whole lot better than creating a massive bureaucracy to make people jump through hoops in order to get a few food stamps and then lose their childcare because they got a 50 cent an hour raise. All of that is horsepucky. And that's why even Republicans nationally are talking about a savings account for every child that's born, that is theirs, that you can't pay that we may never have the political will to pay reparations to our native people and our descendants of slaves, the way one could argue that we should. But we can't, there are many things that can target generational poverty and the residual effect of generation after generation, way back when, not being able to buy a house, not being able to be in a good school district, all of those things. And so we've sort of come around and we're trying to make it a little easier for people, you know, if you're a psychologist, you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, if you're trying to survive and get enough calories in you so that you don't fade out at work and that you have enough left over that your kid isn't going to not grow, you know, there, you know, and there's levels. I mean, you really can't plan ahead
Mhm.
at all. You can't plan for the future. You can't imagine a future
Right.
if you don't have the time and the resources to be able to imagine something different. And that's why, you know, that's one of the reasons mentoring is so valuable, is that you help um, open a window to another reality for a child.
Mhm.
That's why I'm a huge fan of the Lunch Buddy program.
Isn't that a wonderful, we have the Lunch Buddy program at our local elementary school, Truman, here 3 blocks away. And our neighborhood association adopted the school and is funneling just lots of lunch buddies in there and doing a collaborative work with the PTA, and and we have an annual picnic there and everything. So that kind of those kind of projects, people working together on a shared value locally, the community, using the money that the legislature is bringing into the community, is what builds that resilience.
But without housing, my husband was a lunch buddy, and I think he had 3 or 4 lunch buddies in 1 year because the families had to move.
Yeah, they don't have housing.
So he lost it. He had to have a new lunch buddy because that kid was suddenly suddenly uprooted and was somewhere else. So stability in housing is critical for good educational outcomes and good emotional outcomes.
I was reading the
Go ahead, David.
article in the Atlantic about how the Wall Street is buying up, capital's coming in, buying up and bidding up houses, huge tracts of houses in communities, and then turning them into rentals. And so I was thinking, is there any way for that, which seems rather predatory to me? I think that's the definition of predatory capitalism. And I was wondering if the states if there's anything the states can do to protect the housing stock from that kind of rapacious taking out of the stock and then driving up rental prices and housing prices.
You know, every community is a little bit different. I think that a path to home ownership is really critical, and they're not making new land. So I think that the land grant, the land banking model, where a nonprofit or a governmental agency owns the land underneath, but people could accumulate equity in the building, and then they can move out. And because the land is not part of the price, other low-income people can then move in and build up their equity and sell their equity to the next. You know, there's a way to. It's almost like it's a way to save. It's a way to acquire equity that can then be plowed into a business or another house. But making sure there's enough housing stock and that people have the variety. I think that we're on the cusp of a rethinking of how zoning and neighborhoods are created, and there will still be a reactionary, not in my neighborhood, this neighborhood has to be big single family homes. I think with the aging population, with people needing help and having, you know, ADUs, or, you know, Portland's been ahead of us with the ADUs. They let go of all their system development fees for ADUs, even in the fanciest neighborhoods in Portland, so that there could be more housing that's diverse in all the school districts and all the communities. But if you go to a city in the south of France where there may be a lot of wealth, there are also a lot of alleys and a lot of cute little nooks and crannies that have good dwellings, good housing stock in them, off of alleys and this way, and it's all beautiful. It's all beautiful. And so we have to rethink what we're doing. And I think that, you know, first you push to have ADUs, you know, and having ADUs in more rural, less incorporated areas, we're getting pushback from the left through the environmental community.
Really?
that the accusation, oh, if you let those rural people build a family compound or build ADUs on their farm, then they're going to want to subdivide it and break it up, and then we'll lose our farmland and our food and blah blah. You know, and they're going to despoil the environment. And you know, there's a real sometimes our allies aren't our friends completely. And so that's why the rural areas don't have ADUs for the most part, is because of the environmental laws.
Mhm.
And I'm, you know, big environmentalist, but I've always been in favor of the small intensive organic farming that you have right outside Paris. You know,
And a
and
walkability,
there
right?
is a grow local movement, but if you're wanting to be seriously grow local and have a small plot, you will end up competing with a mini McMansion builder, the same land, and you won't be able to have your intensive organic gardening and raise beds and local veggies close in,
And the other
because
part of that too, Sharon, is the walkability and the livability aspect. And livability and
exactly.
walkability are now a real estate index. And yet I feel like there's still this very auto-centric mentality. And, you know, there was this seminar called the 880, and it was put on by AARP. This idea that we should be thinking about human-centric building and the idea of planning as a multifaceted operation that we're all engaged in as stakeholders from
Just like health, when you say health, we're talking about mental health, and we're talking about addiction, and we're talking about physical health, and then we're talking about nutrition and exercise. And this was really evident. You asked what I was proud of earlier. I'm going to bring it back to what we're talking about now. The House, I'm first vice chair of the House Transportation Committee. These are big committees. Transportation, you deal with capital, revenue, and operations. All those three things in the rest of the government are split up to different committees. Okay, but in transportation, it's all one. It's a big committee. We know we need a package to take us out to the next 16 to 20 years and to build the bridge and other things. So my chair, who did a brilliant thing that's never been done, and it could only have been possible because of the pandemic, decided to do an incredible outreach effort and have listening sessions, real listening sessions, with every possible stakeholder in our transportation system, of any part of our transportation system, whether it's special needs transportation, cities, counties, asphalt haulers, everything. And so we met with 101 stakeholder groups from all over the state in 81 hour-and-a-half long meetings between the end of last session and Thanksgiving. And they were all, heavily note taken, and we didn't think about our approach until we were done. And so the House transportation package looks different. And we included deep questions about equity, because many communities have been half destroyed. Communities of color have higher rates of emphysema and lung cancer. I mean, there's just,
well, they're talking on the federal
there's so
level.
much, and equity was one of our focuses. And that's why it's woven into everything that we do, along with how do we transition away from fossil fuels in a realistic way as soon as possible.
So if they're talking about doing reparations on the federal level for interstate damage, for things like that you're talking about, so are we really? What was the outcome of this? What was the
We
collaborative?
came up with a transportation package that front-loaded a gas tax plus, and to make up for the impact on low-income people who are driving gas guzzlers. I had a bill that was going to give a great subsidy on taxes and registration for used hybrids and electric vehicles for low-income people who qualified for the low-income tax credit at the federal level.
Great.
So they could enjoy the benefits of a car that's almost maintenance-free and costs almost nothing to run compared to an older gas vehicle. And we were going to not bond. We were going to spend the gas tax, new gas taxes, on maintenance and operation and catching up on taking care of what we have. Okay. And if we don't bond the gas tax, we don't have an incentive to hang on to it. And then we do everything we can to invest in the infrastructure for electric and carbon. And we have a carbon, we're electrifying our ferry boats, be good for the orcas and be good for the environment.
Yes.
And we're doing a hydrogen pilot project in Cowlitz County. And then the utilities and everybody else is doing, there's a whole lot of incentivization to provide the infrastructure for plugins. But hydrogen is working in California, and gas stations could be retrofitted for hydrogen.
Wow.
They could be retrofitted for hydrogen. And what if you live in a rental and you can't afford to have a plug-in? I mean, there's a lot of layers to this. And then other fees were, you bond other things, and you have the carbon tax, and then you incentivize the production. We're doing low carbon fuel production now, and it's all going to Oregon and California.
Speaking of ferry, what do you think of this idea of there's a lady that started the frog ferry. What do you think of a ferry, a pedestrian ferry, that over the river here between Portland and Vancouver?
I think it might be fun for tourism. I don't really know. It's not going to work. Our biggest problem with the bridge is not just commuters. You know, commuters are, where you sort of get the edge of the complaints, but a third bridge isn't going to take care of the truck traffic. And you can put everything on trains and barges you want, but it's still got to get from destinations by truck. And so what you want is to incentivize low pollution trucks, and to give them and not have them idling on a dying bridge. You know, you're not going to move freight on passenger rail or little ferries. It's not going to happen. And so you have to think of the whole thing. And yeah, I could just like you could have Uber and Lyft and buses and light rail and heavy rail and all those kinds of things. Sure, it'd be fun to take. I've been to cities where you take a ferry. You know, I've been to Oslo where they take a ferry to go to the museum. You take these little boats. You know, that's fine. We can do that. I'm not sure. I would rather spend the time making sure that we don't have big diesel vehicles idling in North Portland than allow Amazon and Microsoft employees to live in Vancouver, BC, and subsidize a fast train to Bellevue from Vancouver, BC, so they can live in Canada and work in America, which is, one of the things that people are wanting money for. Right. Oh, we just want you to pay for the study. You don't have to pay for the whole thing. High-speed passenger rail. And some of my best friends are supporting that. Some of the people I most admire who are doing lots of good things think but I think there's other priorities. But I voted for the whole package, even though it included some money to continue working on that. Because you have to look at the whole package.
What do you see as the bridge solution? I mean, aesthetically, can we have something beautiful? What's your vision for that?
I think function can be beautiful. Right now we're in the process of finding out what's changed since the last studies were done, and what can we still salvage. There's a tipping point where if we go too much away from the values and imperatives that were propelling the old project, then we have to start all over with a new environmental impact, and it'll take a lot longer. But there was a lot of work done, and we're looking through that work to see, can we update this piece? Is this piece just an update? Is this piece pretty much the same with just some growth numbers in it? And all of that. And then people are coming up and saying, wow, they did box tunnels over in this country. Let's look at box tunnels. Well, box tunnels would be cheaper, but it would kill the salmon, and that wouldn't help Hayden Island, and we'd have to buy a whole lot of right-of-way, because in order to have a box tunnel, you have to start way up here and way down here because of the slope. Everything is being looked at, very, very carefully and very transparently, and lots of checks and balances. And then we're creating an interactive record of all of the things that have been studied on a website. So that website is going to be growing and getting improved all the time, so that people that suddenly start paying attention down the road before we're done they don't have to ask us to do the same work all over again to convince them. If they're really interested, they can find out and go through the path, and then ask questions of the, the technical experts on, why didn't you do that? Convince me. We're trying to make sure that we have a critical mass of agreement, so that even though we're never going to make everybody happy, we've got enough people who have a high enough comfort level that we'll be able to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially with informed consent.
And a helpful movement to look at the country's infrastructure, highway infrastructure and bridges. That's getting a lot of attention now.
Well, one of the things that you have to remember is that there was a time when corporate income taxes were enormously more than they are now. There was a Republican president. People had one car in the driveway and one income earner in most families. Mm-hmm. They were lucky if they had one TV and one telephone. And we invested in the GI Bill and the highway system during that time period. And now that highway and bridge system is wearing out. We've got more people. People have multiple cars parked out in front of their houses. They've got multiple devices and TVs and computers and all of that sort of thing. And everybody has to work, unless you end up with hitting the jackpot in terms of lucrative careers or inherited wealth. And we've never had a bigger gap between a CEO and the worker bee in an organization. And other countries don't have that gap. It would be unthinkable to have the gap be as huge as it is in most companies in Germany or France.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, Sharon, like somebody, even for myself, I went to school. I went to Clark College. I went to Washington State University, Vancouver, and I got my master's degree in Washington State University in Pullman. I have been working at a local public institution, and I am literally like, this is why I also want to talk about this idea. You have the stopgap of property taxes, the circuit breaker, because there's something not right about, like, you put in the all of the investment in the education and also a home. So when we purchased this home, it was crap. And we've been working on it for years and years and years. And instead of there being some kind of an incentive that says, no, you can't turn around and flip it, but we're not going to tax you on a value that you're not going to realize. I mean, for me, this is an incentive for people to be slumlords. I know that this is like out of the realm of something that we even thought about talking about, but I would love to know what you think about this. I went to the schools, I purchased this house, and the place that I've been working at for 10 years does not pay me a living wage. What is wrong with that picture?
There's a lot wrong with that picture. And it goes back to the days when property owners were the only ones that got educated. And schools were based on property taxes because you had to be a property owner to learn to read and write. And then with the system, we have inherited, just like schools are structured for farming and harvesting. Our property tax system was invented to take care of the landed gentry rather than anybody else. And that's why you had to own, at one point you had to own property to vote. Your public school was for everybody that owned property. It wasn't for people who didn't own property. But the great idea of America was that we would have universal public education. And I'm a big fan of that. I really am.
I don't have kids. I recognize the importance in our community of it, and I'm happy to pay the property.
We have to move to other forms of taxation. What we've done incrementally is to provide property tax relief for people who are below a certain income level. That's what we've done. And we make adjustments to that. And we've finally have and so that means veterans, disabled people, people who don't have a lot of resources, but their house is increased in value, can defer the taxes or have a break. I introduced a bill 4 or 5 years ago that finally got passed by somebody else this year. I supported it, of course, and spoke to it. That would allow you to deduct your medical expenses and your improvements necessary to age in place, the wheelchair ramp, the bathroom remodel, in order to keep your income low enough to qualify for those breaks. And they don't make everybody happy. They don't make everybody feel that it's just, but it's something. And we didn't, a few years ago, we did we balanced our budget on an increase in our state property tax. We weren't doing much in the state. So, and then we've done some offsetting of that, but I am not in favor of balancing the budget by increasing the property tax rates. Most of the property tax that you see is parceled up, and most of those pieces are voted on locally. So the big portion of it goes into your local system, your local public health system, criminal justice system, courts, health, and schools. And much of that is, and the state is doing more for schools now, so that their little levies that you vote on aren't doing the basics as much. And every single school district in the state drew that line of what was enrichment and what was basic in a different place. That's why it took so damn long to fix it. And it's not perfect. None of this is perfect. But the state is picking up a bigger share of what's basic. I would, as a consultant, I would always ask at the beginning of a project, if you had to design a system to do this function without any history, what would it look like? Almost every governmental and public system we have was evolved from point A to point B. The taxes on our devices, all of these different electronic things are oozing into each other's tax and pay thing. You used to, a landline for telephone paid a franchise fee to the city or county it went through, because they went through the dirt there, So certain things that descended from a telephone pay local franchise fees. Something else pays some other kind of tax. It's a mishmash. And then when somebody accumulates another kind of business, they're locked into a different kind of taxation for that. It's a mess. Very hard to unravel. But but not basing our education funding on property taxes is a start.
Right.
We leave it the way it is. We try to make it fair. We try to make it accurate, and we try to make it as much local control as possible. And we provide breaks for people to age in place because it's important to everybody. It's a money saver for the society. It's good for society, and it's good for the person who doesn't have to move because their house is more valuable than their income is.
Yes, because it creates a more stable community, because from what I understand, the numbers show that a lot of the people that we see that are homeless, they're from their own neighborhoods and have lost their homes, which creates tremendous instability. And when you talk about this process, I'm not sure if it's appropriate, but I'd love to add the idea of Kant's veil of ignorance to that process. So you're making these decisions for all of these different people, but you don't know how you're going to be impacted. So the idea of creating this fairness across the board would be a lovely addition to that idea.
Well, I think that the idea of fairness, there's a huge number of opinions on that, but it should be part of what we strive to talk about and understand and get some thoughtful, respectful insight into other people's idea of what is fair.
Mhm.
you know, putting ourselves in other people's places and saying, okay, yeah, I understand that.
Especially when it comes to those reparations that you alluded to earlier, like the reason why it's generational is because of things like redlining. So if systemic uh, unfairness and prejudice have created something, then that should be incumbent upon the system to correct for that.
But anything we do requires other votes
Mhm.
from other communities. And that's, you know, that's why you can get big changes done. Everybody says that it's better if government is equally split so that you can't do any damage. You also can't do any good.
Yeah, right.
You can't do anything bold if you've got two opposing philosophies totally splitting the power. You
And
may
well,
have to compromise more, and that's not a bad thing. It's just that can you do anything bold and urgent when you're stuck?
mhm. And when we let things go for so long, like the infrastructure, and shifted the taxation from wealth to labor,
Yeah.
where we're at now. And speaking of being able to experience what other people have experienced, you were championing the closure of the one federal facility, private facility in Tacoma. I
Prison.
think it's the only private prison in Washington state, right?
Yep.
How it, now that was voted on in that was voted on. Did it pass?
Yes.
It did.
Yay.
Wonderful.
Add that to your list of
Again, it won't be done overnight.
Mhm.
But you know, I think that there's certain things that that we should be very, very careful of doing, and putting them up for pure profit motive. And prison, education, and healthcare come to mind,
Mhm.
and criminal justice
Yes.
and police. You know, the problem with, you know, you talk to, you know, our friends who know their history of racism. The police were police were created to catch slaves. I mean, that's, you know,
Right.
that's the history. And how do you, you know, and I don't know any I almost became a cop. I mean, I was on the list to become a cop in Tukwila. I made it through the obstacle course and the psych test, and they never hired anybody. That I would have been their first woman cop.
Wow.
I ended up being the city administrator instead, but I, you know, instead of being on the night shift, you're driving around, you know, looking for criminals. But you know, I know a lot of police officers, and they believe that they are there to help people.
Mhm.
Bad things happen, you know, and bad things are done by people who are bad, and mistakes are made by people who are good. But you have to look at the roots and say, okay, these are the roots. How do we create new roots? How do we create a new shape here? And then how do we build trust?
Mhm.
Mhm.
You know, the trust. You know, you build trust on an individual basis by being trustworthy. And if somebody says, "What is your biggest achievement?" I would say the biggest achievement is when people tell me they feel well represented. I don't believe that I'm the smartest or bestest legislator. I don't do a lot of bills. I'm more than willing to sign on to somebody else's good idea rather than have staff draft up a competing bill. And I have very eclectic interests, so I'm not an expert in anything. But the people that I talk to feel like they can call me up, that they can get an appointment. They feel like I will explain when I disagree with them, I will explain why. And when people get into it with each other on my Facebook page, I say, go do that somewhere else. This is, you know, we don't have, and I don't, unless somebody's threatening or does something really ugly, I don't block anybody if they live in my district. I block people that come from some other place that are trolling me. But if I know they live in my district, I don't block them because I don't want to believe that everybody agrees with me or that they love me, because they don't. And my community is as split as every other community. So nobody's, I'm not going to please everybody all of the time. But, people feel like they can trust me. A lot of people trust me. Mm-hmm. And that's really important. And it's not unique. People gripe about politicians and want term limits, but they don't unelect their own representative. I'm talking about Congress now. And I was elected, I was in the first class of Oregon term limited legislators. Mm. And this is the story, I got a little story about this. And so I was in the first class. The Democrats were out of power for the first time in like 40 years. So the Republicans that had been out of power were in power, barely. And then there was a class of freshmen that were and everybody was term limited. So the old timers said, okay, we've got to suddenly transfer knowledge and skills to the new generation. So what do? Okay, let's pick lawyers from safe districts who are men. They'll get reelected. They won't be a big resource drain to keep their seat. And we'll make them the new leaders. Well, that was the first year of the woman. Do you think we women liked that very much? No, we did not like that very much. That was the way it is. And so they were busily trying to train everybody to be a leader, but they were training the people in safe seats. I was in a swing district. I was a Democrat who won against an incumbent in a district that was like the 17th or the 18th, not the 49th. And I doorbelled all winter long, but and I barely won, the second time. First time I won big, but they had to do something about term limits, and so they had to figure out what to do. It was eventually thrown out. So a lot of the people I served with left and came back. They're now in the Senate, but they had to figure out what to do. And what I noticed looking around as a new observer, big bright eyes, looking around, nobody read anything. They didn't read anything because they weren't going to be around. So grab the soundbite, go with it, get your publicity, and move on to something more fun. It was like nobody had any real in-depth thinking about implications and the future. And there was a senator who was a college professor who'd been there a really long time. And I was walking down the hallway, and he was outside a committee room, and he was leaning with his arms, and he was chuckling to himself. And I said, "Senator, why are you laughing?" And he said, he says, "You know what's going on in that hearing room?" And I said, "No, what?" He says, "They're undoing a bill that I got passed 10 years ago that I thought was the best thing since sliced bread." And I said, "Really? What's so funny about that?" He said, "All these new people around here, they're going to never know the humility and the learning experience of making a mistake. They're doing the right thing in there by undoing my bill. And all these people here are not going to be around long enough to see the impact of what they did and to know it was a dumb idea." He found that amusing.
So, when I think about what you talk about, where really it seems like what drives you is care for the environment and care for people. Like, even though the idea of welfare, the welfare of people, welfare has become a bad word, and politics have become a bad word, but actually in their root, it's basically about how we're governed and how we take care of each other. Exactly. How much do you think it's really a communication issue? You talked about the two questions, but so much of what we all experience, we share that concern. When you talked earlier a little bit about like social media and this noise, this cacophony that's coming at everyone, how much is that about communicating these goods to people, and perhaps they might come together more? I mean, what aspect of it do you think is values versus being able to communicate a public good effectively?
I don't know how to answer that question. I have a smattering of reading of Robert Putnam. You know who that is?
Mm-mm. I mean, I know the name.
The
Remind me.
sociologist in Harvard or Yale who wrote the book Bowling Alone, and he talks about social. He coined the term social capital.
Oh, okay.
Social capital, and the loss of social capital. And he did a lot of research to find out what happened to volunteerism
Ah.
over the last many years.
And
Was it all these women going into the workforce after World War II and after the 50s, when the 50s ended and women started going into the workforce? He studied every possible reason, and the only thing he could decide was that the loss of volunteerism wasn't just women going to work for money or anything else, but it grew with television, making us observers rather than participants. And when the internet started becoming so prevalent, I had this fantasy that the internet would turn out to be the digital equivalent of an Amish barn raising.
Yeah.
And the only thing that is GoFundMe, really.
Mm-hmm.
Or letting people's medical disasters be something people can sympathize with, and if they're sympathetic characters, then people help contribute to them. It also makes it easier for people to be scammed. But I think that the newest generation to come of age is volunteering more than the prior generation.
That's encouraging.
And people my age that are retiring are starting to get involved and do things for free because it's worth doing. So I think that I try to think of it as the ebb and flow of the ocean, and I think we're heading into a more we're having to take care of each other. We're starting to see the writing on the wall that if we don't take care of each other, nobody will take care of us. Our kids may live across the country. Our parents, so a lot of us had parents that weren't living close by, and when they were declining, we didn't know enough to help them. I know a lot of people that are in that situation. We're living a long time, and we can see how important all of this is. And I think that combination of altruism and self-interest can take us a long way, and I think it will. Again, I'm hardwired for optimism.
That's great. Yes, your bubble of positive assumptions. I love that, because I would love to see this more sense of this, like giving back and understanding that the little bit, which is also supposed to be what taxes are and everything else, a little bit from each for the greater good for us all. And this idea of a statesman instead of this bad word of a politician, where where someone is such as yourself, becomes educated maybe in some ways that some people feel like, oh, I could never do that. But that your intent, it feels like you are basically here to let people know that there's a lot of doors of entry to do good.
Oh, absolutely. And there are people that I serve with that wanted it from day one. I have found that most women get involved because they were asked a whole bunch of times, and they wanted to fix something. Barbara Roberts, governor of Oregon, she had a disabled child who wasn't being well served by the school system, and that made her active. There are people on city councils that they couldn't get the potholes fixed in front of their house. I was interested in lots of things, but I never saw myself. When I finally got strong-armed in Oregon, I said, I'm not going to do it. I have 9-year-old twins. I'm really busy. I'm going to find you somebody. So I started asking around, and my friend said, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? And I have this good friend who was a neighbor there, and she said, she says, why aren't you doing it? And I said, well, I'd have to be in Salem a lot, and my husband's working in Vancouver. And he has Monday nights where he comes home really late after council meeting. I don't, and she says, Sharon, she says, you took care of my kid when you were a consultant writing a report, and my little girl got to sleep on your couch all day when she had a fever and I had to go to work. I will tuck your kids in at night.
Oh,
if you and Ted can't be there.
oh
And the other neighbor said, they can come here after school.
my goodness.
And so that's why I did it. And the clincher was not that. The clincher was that I dawdled and looked for somebody, and the people who'd recruited me found somebody else who was a local realtor who had been elected on the community college board for 25 years. And so he called me up and said, let's figure out who can beat that incumbent. And I said, yay. And I went down to talk to him, and he said, let me tell you all about me. And he went on and on and on. And then he looked at me and he says, and young lady, little lady, if you pull out of this race, I'll give you a job as my secretary. So when I retire, you'll know what to do, because this is my swan song. I'm Mr. Democrat and I deserve this. And I went home and I looked at my two little girls and I said, am I going to trust your future to a Democrat who could say those words to me? I think not. And I beat him.
Yay!
I got 60% of the vote, and he was a realtor. He had his name on yard signs for 25 years, and I beat him.
Well done.
So I beat him for all the wrong reasons.
Actually, your neighbors were like a very small version.
Until that moment, I did not know I had a competitive bone in my body.
Oh.
The only sports I did were things that were not competitive. Dance, you know.
So what does keep you grounded? Speaking of dance and art and
I have a great husband, and we laugh. I mean, we find each other really funny. We go for long hikes. 2 years ago, I hiked up, spent 7 days hiking up the west coast of Ireland. We went to Machu Picchu a few years ago. One year when I was in Olympia, he went on a trek in Nepal and went close to Everest Base Camp. That wasn't on my bucket list. We do a lot of walking. We listen to music. I have 3 grandkids now. And I want to spend, I like spending time with them. And I garden, and I'm a binge painter, and I have a really great studio, and I'll walk into it. It's pretty messy. It's more organized than it looks. But I paint oil portraits for the most part.
Oh,
I'm dabble in landscapes. You've seen some of my work when I was at North Bank.
yeah. I think your work is beautiful. Absolutely.
Well, I'm really rusty. I'll probably take some classes this summer to get brushed up and get my skill level and my eye back, because it's been a few years since I've done a lot of painting.
Years. Wow. Well, you've been busy, what with passing these laws and so forth that we appreciate so much. Well, you know what, David, maybe we should all say goodbye, and then we'll pick up in Sharon's art studio. But is there anything else, like, Sharon, that you just would like folks to know? Any final thoughts?
Well, my work for the National Institute for Civil Discourse is really important, and that organization is changing. But I was always nervous about my facilitation skills. Even though I did facilitating, I wasn't comfortable. I had some of the best facilitation training I could have, and I would love more opportunities to use that training to help groups and maybe get back into a little side consulting. And because I feel like I was very, very lucky to have that training, and it's a skill that I always felt I didn't do very well at, and now I'm trained and I'd like to use it. And I think that anything that helps people have deeper conversations and reach deeper understanding, and figure out, sometimes you can figure out how to solve problems in a group where alone you don't have a clue. And I'd like more people to understand that.
Getting to the values that we share, and understanding that problems can be complex and what they say wicked, but that together, sharing those values, we can work it out.
Yes.
Civil discourse with diverse groups of people.
Yes. Yes, yes.
That makes a difference.
Oh, Sharon, thank you so much for being with us today. This has just been wonderful. So
Thank you
let's
so
say
much.
goodbye for now, and then we're gonna. Hey, you guys got to all come back because we're gonna pick up in Sharon's art studio. So thank you.